I never thought I'd say this, but I think that the second season of the Percy Jackson and the Olympians TV show was better than the book. Just hear me out. I don't think this adaptation is perfect. I have my own criticisms that I will also talk about in this video, but in terms of writing, structure, characters, emotions, and themes, I think that season 2 not only elevated the source material, but it also laid some important groundwork for the future of the show. As you have probably already gathered, yes, I have read the books, but if you're a fan only of the show, you can still watch this video because I won't spoil any of the future events and I'll only reference the Sea of Monsters purely for comparison reasons. I'm splitting this review into two rough parts. First, I made a list of the most significant changes that the show made, so I'll go through that list and talk about what I think about those changes. The second part of the video is going to be a more general discussion about the show and its quality. I will also add a small spoilery section at the end because there are some things I really want to talk about, but I can't do that without referencing future events. But don't worry, I'll give a spoiler warning when we get to that part. So, with this whole long intro out of the way, let's get to the first part of my review, which is discussing specific plot changes the show made compared to the book. I'll go through them roughly in a chronological order. The season starts with the reveal that Sally took Tyson in, plus Percy is already aware that Tyson is a Cyclops, while in the beginning of the second book, Percy still saw Tyson with two eyes thanks to the mist, and Tyson was still living on the streets. I think it's a great change. Sally taking Tyson in simply makes sense for her character. She was always very understanding of the situation that the demigod children were in, and she was always kind to them. So it makes sense to show that through her treatment of Tyson here. Also, Tyson being a Cyclops wasn't a big mystery in the book, so it makes sense to streamline the story and get rid of some unnecessary elements for efficiency. The next change I want to address is the fact that our guys actually witnessed the moment Luke poisoned Thalia's tree. I believe it added more weight and emotion to the situation, and once again, it wasn't a mystery in the books. While no one saw Luke poison Thalia, everyone knew it was him, so for a visual medium like a TV show, it makes sense to actually show that moment, not just talk about it. The next good change was adding the detail that the victors of the chariot races are granted a boon. While it still would have been a fun sequence either way, the promise of a boon added higher stakes to the chariot races, while in the book it was just a game, just a camp activity interrupted by the Stymphalian birds. I also believe that the tension between Percy and Annabeth was more grounded and real, more mature and more believable than it was in the book. In the book, the biggest point of friction between them was Tyson, and sometimes their conflicts could feel a little bit inflated for the sake of drama, but the show explored much deeper problems, like trust or growing up in completely different worlds and struggling to understand each other. And while the tension between these two characters in the book felt like a temporary thing, the show managed to tie that tension into the greater themes of the season. Trust was a big theme in Season 2. Choices and how they are influenced by your human side versus your demigod side was another big theme. And this season in general had a very tight writing when it comes to themes, but I'll talk more about it in the second part of my review. Let's go back to specific plot changes. While our guys fought both Scylla and Charybdis in both versions of the story, the book simply didn't have the part about Clarissa's inner conflict and how she had to choose between sacrificing her own men or fighting an impossible battle. And this change did so many things. First, it added so much more depth and emotional weight to Clarisse and the whole scene, and secondly, it once again tied to the greater themes of the season and the whole story, but I will also expand on this in the second part of my review. The next big change is Circe's character. She was much more interesting in the show because in the book she was portrayed as a pretty cartoonish villain. And I know I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but the way how Circe's character was written in the show once again is stronger thematically. Percy Jackson isn't your typical story about good versus evil. Our protagonists fight for the side of the gods, but Greek gods are horrible. Their selfishness turns good people into monsters. We saw that in Season 1 with Medusa, and in Season 2 we see that with Circe. And while Circe's portrayal in the show is very inaccurate to the original myth, Percy Jackson isn't supposed to be an accurate source for these myths. This is a fictional story, and what matters most is whether this version of Circe fits into the narrative within that fictional universe, and, in my opinion, it does. Once again, I'll expand on that in the second part of my review. The next change isn't really a change, but more of an expansion of what was already in the books, and it's the discussion about fatal flaws. Fatal flaws is one of the most interesting concepts in the books, and I feel like it was often underutilized. While both the second book and the second season introduces that Annabeth's fatal flaw is hubris, in the books we don't actually hear Percy's fatal flaw until later in the series, and even when we finally do, Percy doesn't immediately understand the terrifying implications of loyalty being his fatal flaw. I believe that introducing Percy's fatal flaw earlier works very well with how this season was structured, and it also elevates the whole series when this concept isn't remembered only when it's relevant to the plot, and instead it constantly sits in the back of our minds. While I'm still on this topic, there's another small change that the show made. In the book, Annabeth wanted to hear the siren song because it was rumored to make you wiser, but in the show she was forced to listen to it. I think both versions are good and display Annabeth's fatal flaw only in different ways. Book Annabeth showed pride through the choice to listen to the sirens itself, but the show portrayed her fatal flaw through the visions that the sirens showed her, and I think that both versions work best for their respective mediums. The next change is Polyphemus. The show turned him into a pretty compelling villain when in the book he was exactly what he seemed, just a dumb beast. I think this change and why it's good is pretty self-explanatory, so let's move on. On Polyphemus's island, Percy faced a different dilemma. In the book, he was struggling with the idea of killing Polyphemus. On one hand, he is a monster, but on the other hand, Polyphemus reminded Percy of Tyson. Both are Cyclopes and both are his brothers. It was the first time when Percy hesitated before swinging his sword at a monster, and it was a pretty compelling conflict. The show erased this dilemma and instead introduced Percy having to choose between Annabeth and the quest, which in the long run is a more relevant inner conflict. Next is episode 7. While this entire episode was very different from the book, it led to the exact same conclusion: Percy giving Clarice the golden fleece to fly home alone. What I want to highlight is the reason why Percy did that. In the book, Percy had witnessed Ares threatening Clarice, so when they had the fleece, Percy thought back to that moment and he entrusted the fleece to Clarice almost out of pity. It was still a good scene in the book that showed how empathetic and kind Percy is, but the show's approach was way better. It's much more powerful to watch these two characters who hate each other slowly reach a mutual understanding and a mutual respect for each other with absolutely no outside influence. The show turned this moment to be just about Percy and Clarice and not about Ares, making the writing around these two characters feel better. The next change I want to highlight is that Sally plays a bigger role in the show compared to the book. In the book, our guys got back to camp a different way, and I love how the show made Sally give them a ride instead. Also, in the book, Percy didn't even see Sally face to face in the end, while the show included that very beautiful and very emotional scene where Percy talked about watching his mother get crushed by the Minotaur, even if it later turned out that she was still alive. And these are just two examples out of many throughout both seasons. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that while in the books Sally was still a queen, the show makes her feel like a literal goddess, and this change simply sits right in my heart. The next change that I thought was great was the moment of Chris's betrayal. In the book, he never returned to camp in the first place. He was with Luke on the Princess Andromeda ship from the very beginning. And even if, as a book reader, I knew that Chris was on Kronos' side, the moment of his betrayal was still genuinely shocking and chilling with how he stabbed Katie. This is another example of how the TV show, as a medium, has its own strengths. In the book, Percy had no close relationship with Chris, and since the books are told solely from Percy's POV, it made sense to simply establish that Chris was with Luke and be done with it. But the show has the luxury to explore the point of views of other characters too, and since Clarice was shown to be interested in Chris, actually including the moment of his betrayal was a great and emotional addition to the season. The entire final battle was also a show original, so I'll just talk about it later, but speaking of specific changes, I have two more. The first one is the fact that throughout the season, the show established that the gods are already fighting, and I think this is a very important piece of information to have for both the characters and the audience. If the gods are already at war, it shows just how serious this whole conflict is. and it also leaves our main characters completely alone. As Percy said it himself in episode 8, there is no divine intervention to come to their rescue. These kids are on their own and it's very scary. I know that this change might seem small on the surface, but I think that it does a lot in the long run. The final change I have is a huge one, and it's the Thalia plot twist. So, in the book, the big twist was that Thalia wakes up, nothing more. The show revealed that she will wake up in the middle of the season, and instead, the big plot twist was that being turned into a pine tree wasn't a mercy, but a punishment from Zeus. I have no idea how other book fans reacted to this change, because I've been away from Percy Jackson fandom spaces, but personally, I think that this is a fantastic addition to the story. On the surface, it is a big change, sure, but it fits surprisingly well with where Thalia's character goes next. It also, once again, fits with the greater themes of the whole story. And if we analyze this plot twist purely as a plot twist, then it was also less predictable than Thalia simply waking up. Now, I do have one complaint about this. I believe that the show still should have kept the original plot twist too, instead of explicitly establishing that Thalia can be brought back multiple times. That way, when Thalia came back, the audience would think that this was the big plot twist, even if it was a bit predictable, and then the show could have done the double plot twist by revealing that Thalia's fate had been alive this entire time. But that's just my small idea, and overall, I loved the show finale. And these are the main changes that I personally wanted to highlight and defend. It bothers me when you have all these book purists who criticize an adaptation just because it made some changes without trying to ask themselves why those changes were made, without trying to even entertain the idea that, hey, maybe sometimes change is good. I believe those people never tried to actually imagine what would happen if the book was translated to screen one-to-one without actually adapting, and that's a key word, without adapting it to a completely different medium that simply works under a different set of rules. But now let's move on to a more general discussion about the second season of the show. Unlike the first part, this part will have some criticisms, but as always, let's start with the positives, not the negatives. The first season, in my opinion, was a bit shaky. The most glaring problem was probably the pacing and very short runtimes. It felt like the main problem with the first season wasn't even the content that we got, but everything that we didn't get. After each episode, I felt like there was something missing, like it ended way before it should. Unlike season 1, in season 2, there wasn't a single episode that felt like it ended too soon. The pacing was great, and the funny thing is that the runtimes didn't get longer at all. It was the writing itself that got much tighter. And when I tried to figure out why it felt so much better, I think it's because of how the season was structured and how it approached writing its themes. Every scene, every conflict, every character felt like it revolved around the same group of core themes, which made this season feel like a continuous story instead of a collection of unrelated events. To be fair, Season 1 did that as well, but in Season 2 it was simply done better. So, let's look at some of the themes and how this season explored them. The biggest theme, obviously, was making choices and how they are influenced by your human side versus your demigod side. Episode 4 in particular stands out. Annabeth made a human choice, which led to Thalia making a human choice, which led to Thalia being turned into a pine tree. That guilt now haunts Annabeth, and it also makes her constantly question herself and doubt herself. In the same episode, only in the current timeline, Clarice is facing her own impossible choices. At first, she tries to make the hard choice and sacrifice 6 of her men, but in the end, her human side wins, she changes course, and by doing so, she dooms the whole ship. Now, obviously, the one with the hardest choices is Percy. Before Thalia wakes up, Percy thinks that he is the child of the Great Prophecy who will have to make a single choice that either saves the world or destroys it. And we get a small taste of that when he has to choose between Annabeth and the Fleece. But what I think is a more interesting thing to discuss is the structure of the season and the placement of when Percy's fatal flaw is revealed and also his reaction to it. Episode 3 ends with a reveal about the prophecy and the choice that Percy might have to make. Entire episode 4 deals with choices. Percy hears Annabeth talk about choices, and he also sees Clarice put in a position where she has to make choices, and, most importantly, he witnesses the catastrophic consequences when a wrong choice is made. Throughout all of this, the knowledge about the prophecy sits in the back of his mind. So when in episode 5 he finds out that his fatal flaw is loyalty, his visceral reaction is a natural consequence to what was shown in all the previous episodes. In other words, it was a payoff to a slow build-up. I absolutely adore when Percy told Annabeth, "If I had to choose between saving you or saving Olympus, Annabeth, I'd burn it all down." In any other context, in any other story, this could be read as a romantic moment, but the brilliance of this scene is that romance is the last thing on Percy's mind. The point of this scene is the terror that he feels, how he fears himself in that moment, and the audience is right there with him, because just in the previous episode, we saw a whole ship being blown to pieces because of a single wrong choice. And the prophecy, the great prophecy, is also something that sits in the back of our minds. I also want to emphasize that Percy does not say that he'd let it all burn, but that he'd burn it all down himself, emphasizing why the gods may see Percy as a danger. He holds the power to destroy them. So, when by the end of the season, Thalia, another potential child of the Great Prophecy, wakes up, we once again feel that fear from episode 5. And what I just gave you, despite my lengthy explanation, is just one specific example. But strong themes and a great structure applies to the whole season, to every event and every character. I want to give a couple more smaller examples. Another big theme this season was trust. And to give some specific examples, Annabeth and Percy had to relearn how to trust each other over the course of the season. Percy and Clarice, who hate each other, had to learn to trust each other. Percy had to trust Luke to heal Annabeth with the golden fleece instead of just taking it and leaving. Trust can also be in yourself. Annabeth struggled with trusting her own judgment. She was unsure if Thalia would be an ally or if she would side with Kronos. Annabeth also couldn't answer Percy when he asked whether she thinks he might destroy Olympus. We also have Clarice, who had to trust herself to successfully finish the quest and move forward despite what the oracle told her. We can also look at some examples of broken trust and lies. Annabeth was forced to lie to Percy because of the prophecy. Thalia's entire backstory had been a lie this entire time. Clarice broke the trust of her soldiers when she promised them Elysium, something she simply could not give them. Clarice also lied to her men about Scylla when they trusted her unconditionally. Luke trusted Kronos when Kronos was twisting the truth the entire time. Circe's island was also full of deception. Even the audience itself kept getting deceived, like with Polyphemus pretending to be stupid, or with the siren scene and showing the vision of Athena showing up. It would take forever to list all the examples, but what I'm trying to say is that just like with the theme of choices, the theme of trust was also woven into every aspect of this season. Once you start noticing that, it's everywhere, and I think that this thematic and structural coherence is one of the reasons why Season 2 feels like it has such good pacing despite not getting longer runtimes than Season 1. And while I'm still on this topic, I have to talk about how much this season loved using parallels to tell the story. First of all, two sides of the same coin was another big theme this season, but what's interesting to me personally is how it was shown through specifically visual and dialogue parallels. The season started with Percy saying, "You guys get nightmares, right? Probably not like mine." And the season ended with Percy's words, "You guys get nightmares, right? Not like mine, because mine just woke up." Another example is episode 4, where we saw two children of the big three gods, Thalia and Percy, both extend their hand to Annabeth. In episode 7, Percy and Clarice were like two sides of the same coin when Percy went after the fleece and Clarice chose to help Annabeth. In episode 8, Percy disarmed Luke with the same move that Luke used to disarm Percy in episode 7, which is also the same move that Luke taught Percy in season 1. We saw how Zeus treated Thalia as a weapon, but when Percy asked Poseidon if he only had him because of the prophecy, Poseidon replied how there are more powerful forces than the will of the gods, love being one of them, which pretty much confirms that Poseidon genuinely loves both Sally and Percy as much as a Greek god can love. We also had some smaller parallels, like starting and ending the season with Clarice telling Percy, "Shut up, Jackson," except by the end, these two characters were in a completely different place when it comes to their relationship. There were also some indirect parallels that you don't necessarily immediately notice unless you look for them. My favorite example was probably Circe's line, "Heroes only love you as long as they need you." On the surface, she was talking about demigods, but this exact same sentiment can be applied to the gods too. Greek gods only love their children as long as they need them, and that is the core reason why so many demigods are switching sides and joining Kronos in hopes to destroy the current system. But I think I talked enough about the themes and the structure of the season, so it's time to move on to some other things. Another compliment I have for Season 2 is how the characters were handled. First of all, a huge contributor was the fact that the show explored different points of view, while the books are written exclusively from Percy's point of view. This allowed for characters like Clarice to shine and also steal the show, while in the book, Percy still kind of demonized Clarice and saw her as a one-dimensional bully. Showing different POVs in the show also gave us some really fun pairings, like the dynamic between Clarice and Grover. Another standout character besides Clarice was Tyson. Having badass characters like Clarice is great, but being kind, sweet, and gentle is an even bigger strength. Tyson had, frankly, a shitty life, but he never turned into Polyphemus. He turned into a great hero, an MVP of the season, saving everyone multiple times without ever losing his gentleness. I also adore how the show took a more neurodivergent approach with Tyson instead of presenting him like a child, as the books did. I feel like in our world, we need more characters like Tyson. And while I'm still talking about him, I have to highlight his line, "I prayed for a friend and I was sent a brother." I watched that scene multiple times and just thinking about this line makes me want to cry. And it's a really simple line if you think about it. But that's one of the reasons why I actually love Rick Riordan's books. His style always conveys maximal emotional impact through the simplest language possible. And this line from the show, while it had a slightly different phrasing than the book, it still perfectly encapsulates one of the many things that Percy Jackson fans love about the books. But going back to the characters, other than Clarice and Tyson, other characters and their arcs were also handled very well. We saw Annabeth's inner turmoil I already touched upon earlier. We saw Grover trying to hold on to hope in a situation where it would be easy to feel powerless and without any agency. We saw Luke's slow descent into rage and his slow corruption. All the main characters ended the season in a completely different place mentally compared to the beginning, and I believe that character growth, or the opposite, character decline and corruption, is an essential component if you want to have a good story. We obviously can't talk about characters without mentioning the main character. Percy's journey, in my opinion, can be described as a reluctant hero. He started the season talking about how he is too much human and not enough demigod. He was afraid to make any choices after learning about the Great Prophecy. In Season 1, he went on a quest to save his mother first and to prevent the war second. In Season 2, he also went on a quest to save Grover first, to save Annabeth first, and to get the fleece second. But by the end of Season 2, he had his hero moment. He had his big rallying speech. He accepted, in his own words, that even if you want that quest, that prophecy to be about someone else, sometimes you have to step up. Sometimes there's no divine intervention to save you. Obviously, this is not a deep dive into the characters. I'm only doing a very surface level analysis, but my point is that the writing this season felt very good and some characters were handled better than they were in the books. Next, I want to briefly touch upon a more technical side of things. I think that season 1 of the show already looked good and had a nice cinematography, but season 2 was absolutely stunning. And as far as I know, the budget didn't really increase, so it was probably thanks to the creativity of the people working in those departments. The sets were gorgeous, like Circe's Island, for example. The cinematography was stunning, like the storm in episode 4, or the final battle, or the shot of Percy and Thalia falling at the same time. The action and fight choreography had an insane improvement compared to season 1. Just look at how dynamic and exciting were the chariot races, or the final battle, or fights on the Princess Andromeda, or the fight against Scylla and Charybdis. The acting was also impressive. Percy's actor did a lot with just his face. Tyson's actor literally only had one eye to work with, and even through all the CGI, the emotions still got through. And in general, I don't think there was a weak link in the cast. Humor was also better compared to season 1, and it also got closer to the specific kind of humor that the books have, like fighting the Stymphalian birds with the power of Mariah Carey, or including Mitch from Blockbuster as part of Clarissa's crew. But still, I think that there's room for more, and I hope that the next season can deliver. To emphasize this point, I want to show a couple of examples what kind of jokes were made specifically in the Sea of Monsters book. There was one scene where Percy asked, "How are the Laestrygonian giants called in English?" and Annabeth told him, "Canadians." Then there was one of the monsters cut from season 2, and that is a Hydra. If you don't know, a Hydra is a monster with multiple heads, and when you cut off one head, 2 grow back instead. Now, in Percy Jackson books, the mythical world and the real world are literally tied together. So, in the Sea of Monsters, the Hydra was tied to a donut shop chain, and when Percy cut off one of its heads, Annabeth was like, "Oh, great, you just opened another monster donut shop somewhere." This is absolutely ridiculous, and I wish that the show would lean more into that kind of humor from the books. And the last good thing I have to say before I get to my critiques is that this season simply had many cool details, so I'll try to give a few of my favorite examples. Thalia's barrier was repelling monsters through lightning, which is fitting given that she's the daughter of Zeus. Characters also have consistent color palettes assigned to their clothes, and what's cool is that the show played with that sometimes. For example, in the first episode, Percy was wearing Annabeth's colors, while Annabeth was wearing Percy's colors, because they were in conflict with each other. Or in the final episode, when we had that scene between Poseidon, Percy, and Tyson, all 3 of them had one piece of blue clothing. Things like that are easy to miss, but it shows that this adaptation was made with care. There were also many Easter eggs for the book fans, but I'll mention a few examples in the spoilery section at the end. I also loved the meta joke about not knowing how to pronounce Scylla and Charybdis. Many book fans, including me, have shared that when they read the books, they just used gibberish for some of the words or just pronounced them incorrectly. So it's really cool how the show kind of indirectly poked fun at that. And the last cool detail I want to highlight is that the whole saying about being stuck between a rock and a hard place literally goes all the way back to the myth about Scylla and Charybdis. So it was really cool how entire episode 4 was centered around making difficult choices. And it's finally time to balance out all this praise with some, hopefully, fair criticisms. First, I think that the show, both seasons 1 and 2, does a pretty poor job at basic world building. People who've only watched the show without having read the books don't have that foundational world building, like why are the Greek gods currently in America? Or why is Mount Olympus currently located at the top of the Empire State Building? What's the purpose of having a camp for demigods? Why do our demigod characters never use phones even if the story is set in the modern world? What's up with the necklaces that all of our demigod characters in the camp wear? These are some pretty basic questions that the book series answers in the very beginning. And it doesn't even take much time to do that. In the first book, it was literally just a few paragraphs, so I don't understand why the show is neglecting this basic foundational world building. There are also world building details that have significance to the actual plot. One of them is metals and magical items. The show keeps mentioning celestial bronze, but it never actually explained what's the significance of that. We also have magical items that have names and deep lore behind them, like Percy's sword or Luke's sword, but the show once again neglects this part of the world building. Without spoiling anything, all I can say is that they are leaving out pretty important things, and I fear that this might have very negative consequences for the future of the show. The only weapon that was given some actual attention was Annabeth's dagger, and those scenes didn't take up much screen time, did they? So I just don't understand the choices behind some other world-building details. Another thing is that we are 2 seasons in and the River Styx oaths haven't been mentioned even once. This is basically a binding oath that you can't break without serious consequences. And the funny thing is that season 2 actually had a perfect opportunity to introduce this concept. We had that scene where Kronos offered Percy to tell him the great prophecy in exchange for the golden fleece. So they literally could have added a couple additional lines to that scene and explained the concept of swearing upon the river Styx. There are also other world-building details that don't necessarily affect the plot directly, but they are the things that make the world of Percy Jackson feel so magical. For example, Camp Half-Blood in the show doesn't feel like home at all, so any threat to the camp feels cheap as a consequence of that. In the books, the camp feels alive. It feels like home and a big family. You have other campers, you have pranks, you have plenty of rule breaking, like smuggling food and drinks from the outside to the camp. You have campfires with singing and s'mores, and the fire actually grows or shrinks depending on the mood of the campers. We get to see their daily lives, including all kinds of activities, lessons, and even chores. But the show has none of that. The camp is basically just a background thing, and all the campers are like strangers. When Tantalus was gone, it made no sense how the show portrayed that the campers still followed his orders and went against Percy and the others. Because in the books, all the campers cheered when Tantalus was finally gone. The camp, with all its campers, is one of the central settings in this universe, so it's just disappointing how empty and pointless it feels in the show. Another thing that the show neglects is powers. We didn't even see the powers that the children of other gods have. Why not include a small scene where someone walks past, let's say, a child of Demeter, and we see how that person is manipulating a plant and making it grow faster? Things like that make the world feel alive and complete. But even if we look only at our main character, Percy, even his powers in the show are severely underexplored. At this point in the books, Percy was like a proper waterbender, but in the show, the last time we saw him use his actual water powers was in Season 1. All that Season 2 showed us was that Percy has perfect nautical senses and that he can understand horses, but that's so little compared to what he did in the second book. For example, in the show they used the wind thermos to move their boat and get away from Princess Andromeda, but in the book, Percy has full control of any ship, at least the smaller ones. If he tells a boat to move, it moves. If he tells the ropes to tie themselves into a knot, they do. If he tells an anchor to rise, it does. The show constantly tells the viewers how powerful the children of the big three gods are supposed to be, but they don't really show it. There are also smaller but equally cool powers, like the fact that Percy can telepathically communicate with all sea creatures, and obviously horses and Pegasi, because Poseidon in the Greek mythology is the father of all horses. In the show, by removing all these powers, the demigods don't really feel special. They feel like regular kids put into impossible situations. At the very least, the show could emphasize it a bit more often that these kids are literally half gods, so they are stronger and more durable than regular mortals. There's also stuff like the mist. The show told us about it, but it never actually showed us how it works. For example, In book 2, there was a scene where the golden fleece turned into a regular jacket as soon as our characters were around mortals. It's a small thing, but when you have so many of these small things, they absolutely add up to something significant that the show lacks. The lack of proper world building, in my opinion, is the main problem of the show. But I also want to discuss another issue, and it's that sometimes the exposition and the dialogue has some problems. For example, in episode 6, after Percy's dream and when he said that he was dreaming about someone other than Kronos, Annabeth asks, "What did he look like?" And Percy replies ominously, "She," and then we are shown Thalia's face. The scene absolutely should have ended there. It delivered everything that it needed to. But instead, they kept going and over-explaining stuff, which broke the momentum and the tension of that scene. There was one good line about how dreams never lie even if you don't fully understand them, but that line could have easily been told earlier in that scene or even in a different scene. Another small example is the ending of episode 6, when 4 hippocampi show up and Grover emphasizes, "Hippocampi, 4 hippocampi." Yes, Grover, thank you, we can count. Or let's look at the whole conversation about the possibility that the Golden Fleece can bring Thalia back. Why repeat it over and over and over again? Establishing it once would have been enough, and it also would have been more impactful. Just because a show is aimed at kids, it doesn't mean that the writing has to be simple. The perfect example of that is Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I am talking about the original animated series. That show was also aimed at kids, but it was by no means simple. Kids can pick up on more than people give them credit for. I won't spoil Avatar if you haven't seen it, but if you have seen it, then think about, for example, Season 2, Episode 7, and all the reveals that happened at the end of that episode. Nothing was explained, and yet enough was implied that even the kids understood perfectly well what exactly happened with that whole backstory in episode 7. Or think about what happened to Jet in season 2. Once again, nothing was said in explicit terms, and yet the audience had no doubts about what happened. So, going back to Percy Jackson TV show, it desperately needs to work on how it does dialogue and exposition. These problems didn't happen often, but there were enough of them to be noticeable. And I know there's the whole thing about rapidly declining media literacy, or how people often watch shows with another screen in their hands, with their phones in their hands. But I believe that writers should never sacrifice their artistic integrity for the sake of catering to those audiences. Just look at what happened with the final season of Stranger Things. You didn't even have to watch that season. You could just listen to it like a podcast or some kind of radio show and still follow along with the plot just fine. And that is poor writing. Now, I don't want to lump Percy Jackson TV show with the final season of Stranger Things, but there's definitely room for improvement, and there were enough moments that made me worried. And that's all I have for the second part of my review, and also all I have for the spoiler-free section. Now I will mention a few things relating to the future, so if you don't want to get spoiled, then thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. But if you are still here, then this is what I want to touch upon. First, I was so happy to see the blue Toyota Prius, and I also loved the subtle detail that when Percy saw that car, he asked, "Whose car is this?" So even the show-onlys can pick up on this detail and think to themselves, yeah, that's a good question. Whose car is this? Another detail that I liked was that the charm speak power was mentioned. Now, it could be just an Easter egg, but I really hope that we actually get to see this power being used in the show. Maybe even by Selena, because the original book series really did the whole Aphrodite cabin dirty, when Aphrodite is actually one of the most terrifying goddesses, if you really think about it, and so is the charm speak power in the books. Next, I want to mention a few bigger spoilers. First, I love how this season created a direct parallel to the whole series finale, when Percy has to choose if he should give a magical object to Luke. And the best part is that the outcome of this choice in Season 2 is the complete opposite of the outcome in series finale. Giving Luke the fleece was framed as something that destroys the world, but giving Luke the dagger will be something that saves everyone. This parallel also ties to what Annabeth said this season about how you never know if something is the right choice. So all you can do is just trust yourself and try to do the right thing. And in general, I feel like if we get all 5 seasons, then Season 2 has the potential to feel even better on a rewatch, when even all the new fans can notice these details and subtle foreshadowing. Next, I want to discuss Allison's addition. On one hand, it's good to have a face for the demigod army on Kronos' side, but on the other hand, at the moment, that face seems very punchable. I hope that because of Allison, the show doesn't erase some future characters like Ethan, because with them, you could actually see why some demigods would want to join Kronos. One of the best things about this book series is how they always operated in the gray area. It wasn't just black and white, it wasn't just a fight between good and evil, and I worry that the show might stray from that path by villainizing one side, like they seem to be doing with Allison at the moment. And while I'm on the topic of Allison, I am not sure about the choice to make her a child of Apollo. I think it would have been more interesting if she was a child of Athena instead. Season 2 already established her rivalry with Annabeth, so it would have been cool to see a deeper thematic bond too. Both daughters of Athena, both hurt and abandoned by their mother, only one of them is still good, while the other chose to join Kronos. I don't want to judge too early. They still might do something interesting with Allison being a child of Apollo next season, when we actually meet Apollo and also the hunters of Artemis. But at the moment, her parentage seems a bit random and pointless. One interesting thing, however, is Allison's rising tension with Luke. This is not my idea, so I don't want to take credit for it, but I've seen someone suggest that it would be interesting to see Luke kill Allison when he gets more and more corrupted by Kronos. I actually want to put my own spin on this theory. What if Luke kills Allison before being overtaken by Kronos? So this act would serve kind of like a breaking point that weakens Luke's soul enough for Kronos to fully control him. And it would also create a nice parallel about how hatred weakens your soul, while love, and more specifically his love for Annabeth, in the end ends up saving his soul. I am not the biggest fan of my own theory, to be honest, because I hate when characters are reduced to a plot device, but I would rather have a good plot device than a boring character, and so far, Allison didn't exactly convince me why is she needed. Next, I want to add a bit more to the discussion about the Thalia plot twist. I already explained why I love it earlier, but I have one more reason. I think it actually subtly sets up Hades, his children, and their fatal flaw. We all know that Hades sent the Furies after Thalia as an act of revenge against Zeus, who killed Maria the Angela, but I feel like pitting Thalia against Zeus is a much bigger revenge than simply killing her. It becomes not just about holding grudges, but about grudges that grow over time, and I think that this might make Nikos' character a bit more interesting when he leaves and the viewers are left wondering what he will do next. Another thing I want to discuss is that I saw an interview where Percy's actor mentioned that the fans, apparently, are worried that the show is pushing Percabeth a bit too early and a bit too much, and I disagree. I just reread the Sea of Monsters, and I can tell you that Percabeth was going strong, guys. In this book, Percy literally used the word jealous when talking about Annabeth and her relationship with Luke, so I really don't think that the show is leaning too much into shipping. I also think that specifically how the show portrayed Percabeth this season actually helps with setting up Rachel and Calypso. Percy and Annabeth talked this season about how Percy is from the human world, while Annabeth is from the demigod world. With Rachel, Percy was desperately seeking that sense of normalcy. He tried to run away, even if it was temporary, from all the pain that being a demigod brings. When Percy asked Annabeth after that conversation, "Does that mean we can't be friends?" that was such a loaded question. Yes, they can be friends, but it's not easy. They have to choose each other over their differences. The show removed the aspect of the rivalry between Poseidon and Athena, but I believe that they introduced a much more compelling conflict instead. As for Calypso, she symbolized a way for Percy to get away from making that choice altogether. With her, Percy didn't have to be a human or a demigod. So, once again, I believe that Percabeth in the show's second season doesn't go against Percy's future love interests, but actually helps to set them up. And one last teeny tiny detail that I have is that I am praying to all the Greek gods, except Zeus, that in season 3 we actually hear Blackjack talk. I need to hear him call Percy boss. It's too iconic to remove. But that's all I have. Believe it or not, I tried to be concise. I tried to remove half of the things I wanted to say, but I guess now I regret not talking about this show episode by episode instead of trying to squeeze everything into a single review. I might change my approach for season 3 if any of you are interested to hear what I have to say. But for now, thank you for listening, share your own thoughts in the comments, and hopefully I will see you again next time.